So we'll call the meeting to order, and the minutes from last meeting aren't quite ready, so we'll have them in 2 weeks to discuss. So the next item on the agenda is a discussion of any ARPA related questions. With CLA, do we have any?
No, we have none. I don't know if any would sort of pop up now while we have Hannah, but if not, we can move on.
Yes.
Point of order, do we need to do a roll call? Okay. No, okay. Thanks. I'll stop myself.
I think so we had discussed that if ARPA related questions come up, we would have CLA here to answer those questions. But we didn't have any questions from the last meeting.
Is there anything that
Yeah,
they would like to transmit to us? I mean, CLA.
Yes. CLA, do we have any updates from you? Anna?
The only update from the last time we met was that the Treasury, being the Treasury, released some additional requirements. So this is kind of more of an informational for the county that we will be making some modifications to the portal to keep up with the changing requirements by the Treasury for additional information they want to collect. But, nothing earth shattering. But, we're staying on top of it. They released it on Friday and won it for the 7/1, the reports that are due next month. So they didn't give a lot of notice, but we're working through it.
Great. Okay. Seeing no other ARPA related questions for CLA, the next item on the agenda is the local funding overview from Civilytics. So Jared is with us this morning. So we have covered the federal overview and sort of the state overview. So Jared's going to talk to us this morning, actually right now, about what some of the town's plans are for their ARPA money. So Jared, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Paul. And as a brief update for last time, we talked about the state funding, but since then it appears the legislature and the governor are in a bit of a tit for tat about whether the ARPA money will actually be used for a lot of the things we discussed. I am new to the Commonwealth, so you all probably understand this better than me. I think when a law is passed that the money then is going to be spent, but apparently there's another process so the legislature can hold that ARPA money back or reallocate some other funds. And so that process is now ongoing. They did say in the bill to spend the $4 billion of the $5.3 billion, but that is looking like it may not actually happen. So the priorities might look similar. They were signed by the governor and passed by the legislature, but whether ARPA money gets used for that or surplus money gets used for that and the ARPA money gets held for something else is to be determined. So unfortunately, that creates more uncertainty for you all at the county level than less. But I wanted to make sure we shared that. I shared that update with you so that, you're aware of what the latest is.
Yeah, and I can just, the governor decided that he would outline his plan for spending the remaining $2.3 billion in state allocated ARPA funds through an economic development bill that he filed in April. So that's his plan. The legislature, being of a different party, might have a different approach. That some of it will likely move in concert with the annual budget, which could be done in a couple of weeks. But there's also some sentiment in the legislature to hold some of the money for the new governor, because this governor has announced he's not running. And I think we can all figure that piece of it out. But that is a little bit of a wrinkle on the state side. So go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So, but the nice thing is the municipality part is probably a little easier for us to understand. So I'm going to just point out the money that is allocated to municipalities so we all have a sense of the scale. Talk about some of the specific earmarks that municipalities are slated to receive from the December 2021 bill that the governor signed. And then talk about an update about municipalities' applications for county funds. And then finally, we'll talk about what municipalities' leadership has been saying about their intentions for ARPA funds. So this is a recap, and you have these slides, and you'll have a written memo that contains all of this information written down. So, hopefully you don't have to remember too much, but it is important to point out municipalities did get, and they have this money in their bank accounts, collectively $26 million direct ARPA payments that they have. And we're going to talk about what they have done with that, or what they've signaled they'd like to do with that $26 million that they directly received. In addition, the school districts operated in Barnstable County by the municipalities received an additional $27.2 million through the ESSER 3 program. And education being one of the more expensive services provided by governments, it's important to point out that there was a separate set of funding that is directly going to the education system. And then you all are very aware that your county has agreed to make the $10 million available by application to the county, to the municipalities. In addition, we wanted to also point out that there's additional set-asides and rules around funding for tribal governments. So the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe has some additional aid that they're eligible for. So all tribal governments received a separate funding allocation, like municipalities, like county governments. And in this case, it adds up to about $13.7 million was the allocation there. It's important to note that this is also fiscal stabilization money, but the Treasury ruling and the legislation says that by default, if it's spent by a tribal government, it can be considered under the more permissive set of rules that govern fiscal stabilization funds. That is the rules that are related to being deployed in a disproportionately impacted community. So the law states that it's presumed that any activity taken by the tribal government is de facto in favor of or supporting a disproportionately impacted community, and therefore can be spent under the most permissive set of rules. There's also ARPA has many additional non-fiscal stabilization funds. Sometimes it temporarily increased funding to existing programs, or sometimes it added a second round of other types of block grant funding. And tribal governments were eligible for specific portions of that. And in this case, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe has been awarded $567,000 through the Indian Housing Block Grant Program from HUD, $490,000 for the Resilience and Education Funding Program, American Indian Resilience and Education Funding, and $4.4 million in supplemental stabilization and community development funding, discretionary funding. And so those are governed by whatever the rules are, and are in addition to the 13.7 million. So we wanted to make sure that that's also part of the conversation of the funding that is locally available to other governments besides the county government. Also important that municipalities will also be eligible to apply or receive funding through a lot of what we discussed the Commonwealth may choose to do with its money. So the county would be eligible, but so would municipalities, and we'll talk about the specific earmarks that municipalities are targeting. They also may be eligible for many of the programs and funding we discussed about the infrastructure bill in our first meeting. And it's also important to say, and I'm sure it's front and center on the municipalities' mind, that the most recent legislation hasn't signaled an increase in Chapter 70 state aid to municipalities. So their standard revenue sharing allocation is pretty much the same. And so they aren't looking at a big increase of funding coming through that, although they have asked for it, and it's been floated as a potential, but it hasn't happened yet. So then I want to just list out and remind us about the specific earmarks from the House Bill 4269. Here they are for Barnstable, Bourne, Falmouth, Sandwich, and Yarmouth. We talked about these last time. And so this bill was signed into law in 2021. So these earmarks will sort of happen, but it may not be that they are funded from ARPA funds. They might be funded from the state surplus. And so these are the specific earmarks in each of the towns. And we could see, there's some stuff that would be very much ARPA eligible, and there's some other stuff that's more in the infrastructure side of things. Yeah. But then I want to say we want to learn what are the municipalities sort of interested in. So, they have $26 million of fiscal stabilization funds that they need to think about how they're going to deploy and what if they signaled their interest in. First of all, through the application portal that you heard about, that the county set up for the $10 million, as of 6/14/22, 3 municipalities have applied for county funds, and their total amount that they applied for was $3.47 million. And this is, I think, it ties into what I'm going to say next, which is that municipalities haven't spent very much of their $26 million right now at all. And there's various reasons behind it, but so far most of the municipalities in the county are not required to report at the same level to Treasury as larger cities, but Barnstable is this municipality that is required to file a separate report with Treasury, and from that report we can see that they've allocated about $150,000 to IT services from their ARPA funds as of the last reporting date, which is a while ago, but they hadn't allocated any of their other ARPA funds yet. And then Brewster listed, I saw found in a news article that they had said that they are spending a small portion of their funds on contact tracing and COVID-related expenses, but the rest of their funds they had spoken for. And I think the way we looked at this is we looked at the most recent budgets that towns had, so that the last fiscal year towns had ARPA money in their bank accounts that they could include through their budgeting process. And then we also looked through news articles where covering town meetings on the Cape to find out what the towns have been saying. I think the takeaway is that towns have said and have publicly listed in their budgets that very little of their ARPA money has been spent, maybe less than 1 million across all of them. And a lot of them have been saying either publicly or in their budget documents that they've been waiting to find out how much money is going to come from the county and the state before they make decisions about how best to deploy their ARPA funding. The things that have been floated, and on this slide, it's possible only. These are not commitments that these towns have made in their budgets. These are, things that were said by town managers at municipal meetings. But for example, Bourne was either thinking about using the funds to fill a gap in its sewer-related maintenance contracts, but now they're thinking instead they might use it to purchase 2 ambulances that need to be replaced. Brewster has listed a number of things that they might do with it: paying frontline employees, public health costs, fixing beach access at the Cape Cod Sea Camp property, making the outdoor pool on the property accessible, and remediating the property. Dennis has said that they would like to try to use the money potentially to solve a budget issue with their wastewater program. Orleans has talked about maybe finding a program to help with the tourism and small business impacts on the community or childcare. No specific proposal. Those were just topics that were discussed. And Sandwich said that they may use it to replace revenue that was lost, or to support the Hoxie House grist mill, Sandwich High School wastewater improvements. But firm commitments, dollars that have gone out the door, that we could find a public record of, again, it's a small amount of the money that is available. And I think that's the part I want to leave you with, is that, after looking through the municipality budgets and the proposed budgets for the next fiscal year, ARPA is not present in those documents. And the discussion of ARPA that has occurred around those discussions has sort of been recapped here for you. And I would say the headline is wait and see what comes through the county process, and then figure out how to use the remaining ARPA funds to fill any gaps that remain at that point. And so I'll stop here and open up for questions.
Great, thank you, Jared. Are there, I see Lisa has a question.
I was just curious what the rules are around transparency from the towns on funding received directly from the government on ARPA, but also what they're applying for and receiving from the county and the 10 million. What is the level of transparency of what we're going to find out how the funds are used?
I can speak to the non-county part, and then I'll let the county speak to the county part. The non-county part for Barnstable is the only municipality that's large enough to have to submit a public report to Treasury. And that report will be similar to the rules that the county has to follow to submitting its report to Treasury. Some people think it's enough transparency and it is a burden. Other people would say it's not because it comes out quite late and it's kinds of uses broad category. So, but it's the same as the county. The smaller municipalities don't really have a reporting requirement, and they can choose to spend the ARPA money through their normal budget process, or they can choose to spend it through a special allocation process, depending on the rules that they have set up for expenditures like this locally. And that's something you see great variation in across the country, even among big cities, is the process and the timeline in which people are notified about the decision of the funds. So it could vary quite a bit across the county.
Yeah, good question, Lisa.
Kathy?
You mentioned.
Yeah, so Barnstable has federal reporting requirements that the other 14 towns don't have, but all the towns that have to appropriate any of this money through an appropriation process. So 14 towns would have to appropriate it through town meeting. Barnstable has a city form of government so that they could appropriate through the town council. So we'll have to continue to monitor that situation. Sean, you have a question?
Maybe a little point of information. I hope you're able to hear me. I'm out of town and outside right now. As it relates to possible use of funds, and to Jared's point about what towns are, kind of waiting to hear what money they may be able to get from the county or the state. Full disclosure, of course, I'm on the Open Cape board, and I've heard through secondhand that Provincetown, Orleans, and Bourne would like to do what Falmouth did with the Main Street Gig project, and we're thinking of applying for money from the county to perhaps help fund that.
Great, thank you. Kristen.
Sorry if I missed this, Jared, but what was the timeline for the distribution from the municipalities to get that funding out? Are they restricted in any way, or is it really just kind of up to them as part of their process?
I mean, as a resident in the Commonwealth, I'm starting to get a little nervous about all of us because the timeline to allocate the money is December 31st, 2024. Any money that's not allocated at that time is at risk of being clawed back by Treasury. The money then has to be expended on those things that are allocated by December 31, 2026. So the fact the money's not allocated in June of 2022, there's 18 months left to make those allocations. The money is in the bank accounts, or shortly the final amount is shortly coming into the Treasury for each of the towns. So the final disbursement was supposed to be in May of 2022, and whatever the timeline is for pulling that actually into the bank account. But then the money's here right now.
Yeah, and so I think in 14 of the towns, we might expect that as they go through their normal town meeting process next spring, that the ARPA funds would be allocated. If it doesn't happen that way, that happens through a special town meeting. But yeah, it could be getting closer than we would like. Beth.
Thanks, Paul. I just wanted to reiterate, so for the county, we're required to do quarterly reporting, and any of our sub-recipients will be reporting on a quarterly basis. That's what we're required to do. And for all of the ARPA money, they have to be obligated by 12/31/24 and then spent by 12/31/26. So it's the same regardless of if you're a small municipality or a county.
And Beth, the 3 proposals that have come through the portal, are they all wastewater?
Yes.
Yeah, primarily. So
Yes.
I think one of the things I think we can glean from Jared's presentation, what the counties received through the portal, is that a lot of the towns are looking at ARPA funds for wastewater related projects, or as Sean's mentioned, potentially broadband projects. I think that's important for the committee to keep in mind moving forward. On the wastewater side, there's a big federal bill coming through for, I mean, there'll be more federal money for capital projects, a subset of which will be wastewater. The governor, in a supplemental budget submission to the legislature in the spring, out of Commonwealth surplus funds, has sort of earmarked $200 million of wastewater for Barnstable County to potentially be allocated between Water Protection Trust Fund and the county's septic loan program, which has been modified to allow that program to be used to offset the cost of hookups to the
For
sewer,
residential, yeah.
for residential. So that's $200 million out of the mass surplus. There's more federal capital money that will be coming on the wastewater side. And we already have the Water Protection Trust Fund in place. So there's a lot of money for wastewater available to Cape communities that are moving in that direction. I might be bold enough to say that the least expensive place to build a sewer system in the Commonwealth now is on the Cape, which if you had said that to someone 10 years ago, they probably would have laughed in your face. But I think that's the reality. So the question for the committee is, should more ARPA money go to that, or should we wait to see what the landscape looks like? So there's a lot in play on that. And both, if they have to move through the local town meeting process, both capital projects for wastewater and then potentially some of the broadband stuff too, there may not be agreement. So if you hold it until May for a town meeting, you have a big capital project with ARPA funds, but it's not appropriated, that's when I think we could start to see some local issues. But I think the good news is a lot of the towns have moved on sort of broadband, or are moving in that direction, and a lot of the towns are moving on the wastewater side. Dennis, for example, just appropriated $7 million for wastewater, I think, which is a big win over there. So all of that just to provide some context for our evaluation and prioritization of regional challenges. Karen.
Sorry, it took me a minute there. So to that point, are there any budgets or cost estimates for some of those big nut projects? Like if a major wastewater cross Cape project, do we know what that would cost? Do we know what fixing, if you will, the broadband issue? So that as we think about these allocation decisions, we know if it's going to make a difference in a large way.
That's a good question, Karen. I think what we can do is we can take a look, we can sort of tally the number for municipal wastewater proposals that are in play. There's also a coordinated effort by the Upper Cape towns that involves the wastewater treatment facility at Joint Base Cape Cod. So I think that would be good to take a look at. These are big numbers.
Yeah.
And I think as Sean has pointed out in the past, a last mile program on broadband would be a really big number. But funding municipalities to organize around broadband might be a smaller number. So, but great questions, thank you. Are there any additional questions for Jared or questions about the local ARPA appropriations? Okay. Seeing none, thank you very much, Jared. Informative as always.
Thank you.
And we will move on to number 5 on the agenda today. So we are going to get a little aggressive and we churn through 2 of the regional challenges at our last meeting, water quality and housing. So there are 4 remaining. And Chris Santori is with us this morning, and she is going to run through the remaining 4 regional challenges to give us a brief overview. And I think the way that we'll do it is we'll take them one at a time, and we'll pause for any questions or comments after the presentation of each individual regional challenge. So Christy, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Again, Christy Senatori, Executive Director of the Cape Cod Commission. And the last meeting, I was able to provide a brief overview of the 2 first regional challenges. We talked about water quality and we talked about housing. And so we'll cover the remaining 4 this afternoon, or this morning, I think. We're still morning time here. But we did put 1-pagers together for everybody, so you have all the detailed information in front of you. And I'm going to go through some of it, and then if you have questions, happy to pause and take those. So the first one that I'm going to start with is climate change, and then we'll move through some of the others. But I'm going to actually share my screen first. Hopefully I can do this. All right, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and can you see the slides?
Yes.
Great. So wanted to cover first probably one of the most cross-cutting issues. I think climate change actually touches nearly all of the other regional challenges. It's been identified in all of our regional plans, including our regional transportation plan, our economic development strategy, our regional policy plan, as well as a variety of others. It is impacting all aspects of the Cape's natural, built, and community systems. We're seeing rising temperatures, we're seeing warming oceans. We know that the Cape is vulnerable to a variety of climate-related hazards. Most significantly, we're looking at erosion. Some of those retreat numbers are fairly significant by the year 2100 as we look at projections. Flooding, I think even this past week, we saw more intense flooding happening across the Cape with our intensity of storms and also with that increased rainfall rates that we're seeing. And of course, sea level rise. This is projected to be potentially between 4 and 10.3 feet by the year 2100. And of course, when we look at our greenhouse gases and looking at the greenhouse gas emissions inventory that the Cape Cod Commission conducted over the course of the past year, we know that we need to limit greenhouse gases. And so our 2 highest emitting sectors are transportation, primarily through our on-road passenger vehicles, as well as energy. And this is primarily from our built environment, from the residences that exist across the Cape. So this is the leading cause of our global climate crisis. And you can see here the more granular level of where those emissions are coming from here on the Cape. We know the cost of doing nothing is significant, it's severe. We could be looking at losses of about $50 billion by the year 2100. And these are losses due just to sea level rise and storm surge alone. We could be looking at building damages, decreased land value, significant beach tourism could be reduced, as well as a variety of other potential impacts. We're also seeing impacts to our infrastructure. And so I'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about infrastructure being one of our regional challenges as well. But again, looking at the year 2100 as kind of our benchmark into the future, we know that sea level rise is expected to inundate approximately 200 miles of roadway, but it's also expected to potentially isolate another 700 miles of road. And so that's important when we look at a variety of our critical facilities across the region as well. But the cost of doing nothing also has a variety of economic impacts, including commercial fisheries being at risk, the potential for salt marshes to be inundated by sea level rise, as well as potential for significant loss of cranberry bogs across the region. Our plan includes both adaptation and mitigation, as well as all of the other planning that's happening across the Commonwealth. But we know that here on the Cape, it's going to take a mix of both adaptation and mitigation strategies to really address the climate impacts that we're seeing now. There are 11 priority strategies that we've identified within the Climate Action Plan, and tackling our largest emitting sectors is one of the priorities of that plan, and putting together projects and initiatives that really address some of those priority strategies is critical to addressing the problem. Of course, emissions reductions are required. And when we look at some of the targets that have been established by the Commonwealth, we know that we need to meet some of these emission reduction targets in the near term. So looking at potentially reducing emissions by about 50% by the year 2030 and so forth. And so how we can do that is really through targeted action. And a lot of these things we're hearing about more regularly, looking at electric vehicle sales, looking at the use of heat pumps, and switching to clean energy sources is something that these things need to be prioritized for continued action. So I'll pause there if anyone has questions on the climate front, or I can head right into regional infrastructure challenges if you want, but I'll take a moment to see if anyone has questions or comments.
Are there questions on the climate issue? Whether they're mitigation or adaptation strategies? Okay, I don't see any immediate questions now, but that was a good overview. I think climate is one of those areas where it could be a cross-cutting issue that has to be accounted for, or at least provide a bonus to any sort of grant submissions moving forward. But potentially there could be individual climate-related projects that would come through. Okay, go ahead, Chrissy. Regional infrastructure.
Great. So we'll dive right here into regional infrastructure challenges, and you'll see a little bit of repetition between this and some of the climate issues, as well as what Jared was mentioning before as well with transportation impacts and infrastructure. We are seeing, we have aging infrastructure here in the region, and we know that the demands on our aging infrastructure is highlighting necessary investment. If we look at the average age of the bridges, all of the bridges on Cape Cod, the average age is about 57 years old. We are seeing almost 39 million trips across the canal, and this was in the year 2021. And those bridges were really designed for traffic of less than 1 million vehicles. And again, going back to that number of projected potential isolated roadways due to sea level rise, we know that the existing infrastructure is limiting our ability to grow in a way that really balances the economy, as well as the social well-being of the Cape. So when we look at transportation broadly, there have been significant infrastructure investments, but yet some are still needed in that transportation world. We have over 3,800 miles of roadways on Cape Cod, and 80% of those are actually owned and maintained by the local communities, by the towns. 90% of the roads on Cape Cod do not have sidewalks. And so there have been significant improvements over the last 10 years to Route 28, yet 47% of Route 28 still lacks sidewalks. So really making sure that pedestrian accommodations are continued to be improved upon not only addresses a lot of our transportation impacts, climate change impacts, as well as community vitality. Road conditions are requiring costly repairs. About 15 to 20% of the town roadways are in poor or poor to fair condition. And again, our aging structures are increasingly at risk. Only 66% of the bridges on the Cape were built prior to 1970, and only 9 of those have actually been rebuilt in the last 25 years. I mentioned this as kind of a tangent to the conversation on climate change, but if we look at the town identified critical facilities, 30% of those are actually located within the floodplain. So you can see those kind of yellow orangish dots, and those are really those critical facilities that are at risk to flooding. And addressing the wastewater infrastructure piece here, 80% of our nitrogen contributing to coastal water quality degradation is coming from our on-site septic systems. We are seeing significant progress from many of the towns. Almost all of the towns are actually making some progress in addressing our wastewater issues and nitrogen and nutrient impairments in our coastal water bodies. And we're also seeing, hopefully, some significant resources coming into the region. The Water Protection Fund has been highly successful. And most recently, there were 4 communities that were awarded grants through the Water Protection Fund and over $108 million of projects on the last intended use plan. So we're seeing projects, and I think we'll continue to see more progress here, especially as these significant funds come into the region. So we want to look also, as we look at infrastructure, we want to look at stormwater and drinking water as well. And so we also need to make sure that we're looking at our stormwater management planning and accounting for some of those increased volumes that we're seeing on our roadways. We obviously want to take a look at some of the existing stormwater infrastructure and identify areas where we may need to make investments in upgrading some of that infrastructure. Drinking water, I think the Cape has a fairly successful drinking water program, and certainly our public water supply, though, is challenged by some of these emerging contaminants that we're only starting to learn more about. 3 of our towns are presently treating for PFAS, and 33% of the water storage tanks on the Cape are over 50 years old. So we're seeing certainly some aging storage and distribution systems. And many of the drought advisories have been only occurring in the last handful of years. And we'll look at energy too, and this is certainly something that we look at in terms of climate, but also makes sense to look at in terms of infrastructure. The increased use of renewable energy is critical for climate action, but we need to make sure that we're making investments in our electrification system so that we can meet that increased demand for different types of energy use. 85% of the homes in the region are still heated by fossil fuels, and we know that effective climate action really requires some significant electrification in these sectors, and so we need to make sure that we're addressing that. So telecommunications, of course, one of the conversations that you've already had this morning around broadband, we know accessible and affordable broadband is key to economic recovery and future business stability. Here you can see this graph at the bottom is really showing the share of Americans with lower incomes who rely on their smartphones to access the internet has more than doubled since 2013. So here you can see that bottom line shows those with salaries or incomes of 100,000 or more. That top line, salaries or incomes less than $30,000 a year. And so these are the percentage of US adults who have a smartphone, but no broadband at home. So they're accessing the internet through their smartphone exclusively. So certainly we're seeing those discrepancies. And to kind of take a quick moment to kind of address, I think it was Karen that brought this up, we really do need to identify where the gaps are in service. And I think I mentioned this at the very first meeting that we had, but really doing that gap analysis and that needs assessment for the Cape as a whole to determine where the gaps are, how the towns might be able to work collaboratively to put some solutions in place to address our broadband needs. So I'll pause there on infrastructure, see if there's any questions or anything I might not have covered that you wanted to address. Then we can jump into childcare.
Are there any questions for Christy on infrastructure? Just keeping in mind, again, I think what the presentation points out is that these infrastructure challenges, well, the cost of addressing them is massive, whether it's transportation, energy, broadband, or public facilities. The costs are really big. So, and I think our charge as a committee is really to figure out what the appropriate economy of scale for spending is, given the resources that are available at the county level. Dorothy.
Just to tag on to that point, as we've been looking at Civilytics and as you were detailing some of the funds flow that are coming from some other sources, when it comes to infrastructure, we've mentioned the 2 bridges. We know that due to your and Christie's and Wendy's and others' good efforts, there is seeking federal and with state involvement work to address that. With the infrastructure bill, one of the things that will be interesting to see is how much of that is assignable to that. So that's going to be one of the more important things for us to understand where that sweet spot is from the perspective, right, of the county dollars as to where it's appropriate. And as you pointed out, what scale is appropriate, but also where there's the gap in terms of where the federal dollars are coming in, where state infrastructure dollars are coming in, because, when we mentioned 28, that's obviously state road, but then where is going to be that gap where it's appropriate for the county to potentially step in.
Right. I think those are important issues to keep in mind as we go forward, and hopefully we'll be able to find a way to visually present some of that information about where other funding sources are coming from, so we can so it provides the appropriate context when we get into discussing the specifics of how the county might be able to spend some of the money. All right, I see no additional questions on infrastructure, so I think we're ready to move on to early education and childcare.
Great. And just to address Dorothy's point, Didn't include the bridges on the 2-pager because certainly we recognize the importance and wouldn't want to take away from that. But certainly I think that there are potential other funding sources for that and wouldn't want to confuse the issues. We really wanted to talk infrastructure more broadly, but certainly recognize the importance of those 2 bridges. So just diving a little bit more into early education and childcare challenges here. We have understand that there's limited availability. There are more children than we have childcare seats in Barnstable County. So the supply, as we understand it currently, there's about 5,200 childcare seats, and the potential need being over 6,500 seats for children aged 5 and under, with all available parents in the labor force. So that really represents about a 23% gap in the percentage of children in the county who potentially need care, but whose families potentially don't reasonably have access to care. This kind of goes without saying, but we know that the cost of childcare in Massachusetts is high, and certainly it's the second highest in the nation to Washington, D.C. And if you look at this in terms of costs for households, the cost for infant care is more than typically the cost for housing. So infant care is running just over $20,000 if you're looking generally an annual cost, about 45% more than the average annual housing cost in Massachusetts, costs more than college in some cases if you're looking at potential in-state four-year tuition. And so if you look at infant care costs, Massachusetts is higher than the rest of New England, and certainly four-year-old care costs. Similarly, the state is higher than New England. So the economic impacts of the childcare gap are significant here. And so if you look at the estimated annual economic losses to the Cape, we're looking at somewhere between 36 and 55 million based on that gap. And if you look at this in terms of Massachusetts, we're looking at about 2.6 billion in annual losses. And you can see those are losses from individuals and families and lost wages, either missing work or potentially reducing their hours. It's losses to employers due to potential lower productivity, turnover, having to train additional staff, replacement costs, as well as state tax revenues due to lower earnings and lost wages. We also know that providers have lower wages in many instances, and while costs for care are among the highest in the nation, early educators and childcare providers on the Cape are facing lower than average wages. And here you can see some of those gaps between preschool teacher median income, childcare worker median income, as well as that median income for Barnstable County. And just to put that in perspective, when we look at the housing crisis, the annual household income needed to affordably buy a median single family home in 2020 was about just under 120,000, more than 3 times the average earnings of a preschool teacher on the Cape. We also saw during the pandemic some of those significant impacts, and among those impacts was a decline in childcare seats, as well as significant workforce impacts to women. So we saw about 20% was the estimated decline in the number of seats that were available for young children for childcare. And the rate at which women had dropped out of the workforce in comparison to men was 4 times. So they really certainly faced significant impacts to women in the workforce. We recently completed a survey where we looked at childcare and providers to really get some information on some of the local challenges that we're seeing. So we completed a family survey as well as a provider survey. In the family survey, we had about 200 responses, and really looking at almost 78% of those respondents found it somewhat or very difficult to find childcare within their budget. And some of those, the greatest share of the families with only one child, estimated spending between $1,000 and $2,000 a month on childcare. Many of those respondents made some significant changes at work to make sure that their children were cared for. So they may have changed their schedule, reduced hours, even switched jobs in some cases. When we looked at the providers, we had about 100 or so providers completing that survey. 71% of the providers that we surveyed had wait lists for children. Many found, over 65% of the respondents said that hiring qualified employees was somewhat or very difficult. And their 65% of the respondents indicated the average annual salary was $35,000 or less. And so we wanted to make sure we were asking some of the questions of our childcare centers, what those major challenges were. And it was really the lack of qualified staff, staff morale in some cases, as well as labor supply. We do have written responses from a lot of our families and providers, and so we're going through those at the moment to see if we can get additional information as we look to potentially hold some additional focus groups to get some more data there. So I'll pause. I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the findings around childcare. And there are, of course, many other people that are much more well-versed in the childcare issues, but wanted to just kind of highlight some of the regional challenges for discussion purposes.
Thanks, Christy. The numbers are shocking, to say the least. Kristen, I see you have a question.
Christy, this is great. Thank you. Just to clarify, the 23% gap that you mentioned at the beginning, that's just a capacity gap, right? Like doesn't take affordability into account. So it's just assuming we can get every child a seat, but no financials involved with that, right?
Right, that's a gap in capacity, but we did ask all of the questions about affordability as well. So we're trying to take all that data now and do the more significant analysis to find out where the gaps are in terms of who can pay and where those challenges are for what levels of income across the region.
Great question. Christy, do we have a sense of where the 23% capacity gap falls compared to the state as a whole?
We do have some of that data and information. I don't have that off the top of my head, but I think we do have a lot of that information that we could probably share at either a different meeting or in between this meeting.
Great. Karen.
And I'm sorry if I missed this. What date was that data as of, Christy?
The surveys we just completed, so those would have been
Okay.
over the course of the last several months.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so
And
much.
I should have prefaced it. We have preliminary results back. I don't have all of the data yet, so we're kind of pulling some of these numbers together, and we will have more definitive analysis within the next couple of months as well.
That's awesome data. Thank you.
Excellent. Dorothy.
This is actually a question for Kristen O'Malley. I know that you and the group that you're involved with has been doing in-depth research on childcare and some focus groups as well. I wondered if there was anything that she wanted to add to amplify this wonderful, horrible, but extensive data.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't been really overly involved with that group that's working on the childcare piece. So, I mean, there's some supplemental data that we're able to get from some of those groups, but we haven't been directly involved with that one.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Are there additional questions? Okay, so childcare, one of the big regional challenges of moving forward. Again, question of economy of scale, given the money we have and what we can do. I did note that on the earlier presentation from Jared that Orleans was thinking about using some of maybe their local ARPA funds on childcare. And we do know that there is a movement on the Ira Cape, really sort of spearheaded by Jackie Beebe, the town administrator in Eastham, to provide childcare benefits out of the municipal budgets, which is really unique. So that's something else we should keep in mind going forward. We have some of these discussions about appropriate use of the county ARPA funds. So with no,
Kristen, have a hand up again?
Kristen and Dorothy, okay, no. Dorothy?
I just wanted to circle back to a point that Karen had made last time when we were talking about childcare and healthcare. And that is, as we think about the utilization of ARPA funds, and we look at that huge salary gap, I mean, there's obviously a workforce training and a shortage, and actually childcare exacerbates the shortage of available workers for childcare. But as you think about trying to structurally impact this in a way that's longer term, I mean, you could subsidize salaries for a short period of time, but that's not going to increase capacity on an expanded basis. So I guess I'm wondering, and we're part of the Massachusetts Business Coalition for Early Childhood Education, advocating obviously legislative pieces to address it as well. But have we gotten any substantive applications or suggestions relative to structural, methodologies that could actually, on a longer term, more sustained basis, keep that capacity going?
But I think that's a great example of appropriate use of the county funds, right? So I don't think anyone's gonna argue that paying frontline childcare workers $14 an hour when you can make $20 at McDonald's is a significant issue. But the question is, what is a sustainable response to that? And whether we have the resources at the county level to do that. If in Massachusetts, 1.2 billion of the childcare costs are paid privately, the federal government subsidizes another 600 million, and the state subsidizes an additional 300 million. So the question about wages for childcare, I think has to be addressed by state or federal funding and subsidies. But there is an ongoing discussion with that. I know Christy and I have talked about potentially a joint task force, have some discussions about how we can look at the model on the Cape, because some of the way childcare and early education money is distributed now works better in a city than it does in a more rural or suburban area. So are there economies of scale that we could figure out some structural efficiencies that might not be in place that would be more appropriate for the Cape? I think that's where the effort really should be. But I mean, the numbers are just devastating. So something has to happen. Karen.
Yeah, just to emphasize that point, a quick story here. The local YMCA opened a child care facility just down the street from our health center here in Mashpee, and it's only 50% open because they can't find workforce at that salary level. So here we have a capacity, they're ready to go, the space is there, but it's just the salary issue.
Yeah, so the salary issue, the labor supply issue is impacting the availability and the number of slots that are available, but even if you can find a slot, the affordability of those slots is a separate question. So I think the good news is that there at least was a federal bill that I think has slowed its momentum, but the state Senate, in their budget deliberations and some of what they put out, have made some serious, want to make some serious commitments in childcare. So that is something that we will monitor and provide information on going forward. So I see no additional questions as it relates to childcare and early education. So we are ready to move on to our final challenge, update and review regional economic stability.
Okay, great, thanks. And again, this is largely based on data and information in the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. And all the data and information that I'm sharing now and have shared previously is available on our website as well as in our data site, datacapecod.org. So in terms of regional economic stability, we look at the Cape in terms of measuring the stability of the regional economy in terms of GDP. And so here you can see 13.6 billion GDP in 2020 reflects really a steep decline from pre-pandemic numbers. We know that our regional economy on the Cape in large part relies on activities related to tourism, retirement, and seasonal or second home ownership. And here you can see our top industries, our health services, professional and technical services, and educational services, and those are in Massachusetts. But if we look at the top industries here on the Cape, we have health services, retail trade, and accommodation and food services. And so those top employment industries really are significantly different than the rest of the state, and they really do reflect a regional seasonal economy. We have a lower labor force participation rate. This also is reflecting our higher retiree population. So we have about over 220,000 residents, currently 230,000 residents according to the last census. About 111,000 people are age 16 or over in our labor force here in the region. So we do have a significant retiree population, not necessarily in the labor force compared to the rest of the state. So about 60% of our population that is workforce age is in the labor force compared to the 67% that's in the rest of the Commonwealth. We also know we have a highly seasonal economy. We can see the employment data here. So these are during those peaks that you can see during those summer months. We don't have all the data yet collected for 2020, but you can see, or 2021, excuse me, but you can see those significant differences in those seasonal peak numbers, and comparing some of our pre-pandemic into current data. And kind of going back to the wages in those tourism related industries, if you look at the Cape and comparing that to Massachusetts, those top industries for the Cape are on the left-hand side there: health services, accommodations, retail, trade. And then the top employment industries in Massachusetts: health services, professional and technical services, and educational services. You can see those wages and you can see those differences in those top industries. And so significantly lower compared to the state's top 3. We know the regional economy was significantly affected by the pandemic, and here we're looking at unemployment from June 2019 to March of 2022. Peak unemployment rates during the pandemic were higher than the state. So on the Cape, we saw our peak unemployment rates at almost 22% in April of 2020 compared to the rest of the state at about 17%. Small businesses, as we know, are the backbone of the regional economy here on the Cape. We have about 80% of our businesses are considered small businesses with fewer than 10 employees in the region. We have about 15.7% of our residents are self-employed, and we do have the majority of our businesses on the Cape have been established for more than 11 years. So almost 80% of those are businesses that are well established. Both wealth and poverty exist on the Cape. So if we look at our median household income, we are lower than the state, but our population that's below the federal poverty level is lower than the rest of the state as well. And so you can see here that distribution of annual household income, with the majority being low income and middle income residents, anywhere from up to $125,000 is, almost about 70%, just over 70% of our distribution of household income, with the higher income residents being nearly 30%. So that's all I have for information on the regional economy. Of course, there's a lot more information and a lot more detail here, but wanted to just provide a very brief overview of what we're looking at in terms of some of those regional challenges and how we've captured that in both our economic development strategy and our regional policy plan to really just provide that framework for the discussion around regional challenges as you get into prioritizing. Many of these, including the economic stability piece, climate change, are really more of those cross-cutting issues, but having the data and information will hopefully help you make some informed decisions as you look to prioritize not only the challenges, but prioritize the types of funding opportunities you see for use of these ARPA funds.
Great, thank you, Christy. I think it's clear from the presentation, the regional economic stability piece, like childcare, is probably one of those cross-cutting issues we might want to consider as we evaluate potential use of the county ARPA funds.
I know this goes without saying, so I probably shouldn't take the time to say it, but the data that we're getting is so incredibly valuable, and obviously what Hannah's providing, Civilytics is providing. But I just want to acknowledge the critical resource that we have in the Cape Cod Commission. Getting this grounding, getting this framework is just so important. And so that's all I wanted to say.
Well, you beat me to it, because Christy leads a staff that does an exceptional job nationally on taking complex information and making it easy to understand, certainly making our job as committee a lot easier to do. So thank you very much, Christy.
Well, you're all too kind, but thank you.
Great. Well, I think that gives us an overview of the 6 regional challenges that have been identified. So I think we are at the point where we can begin to discuss prioritization or how some of these challenges might be viewed on a county level as it comes to potential ARPA spending. But I think one more step that might be instructional before we actually go through any sort of discussion about ranking the regional challenges is the next item on our agenda, which is a continuation of a discussion that we've had over the last 2 meetings. And I think it represents, our effort to get some tangible recommendations back to the commissioners about the use of this money. And so what you have in front of you that Beth and Vera have put together is an outline of a proposal to offer small and large grant funding opportunities from the ARPA funds. So I think what would be good at this point is if we could maybe Vera could step us through the proposal. We could get a sense of what the recommendation of the commissioners might be for a small and large grants program that I think might inform how we go about ranking some of the regional challenges. So if you could, Vera, maybe you could lead us through.
Okay, would you prefer me to do this?
Or Beth.
Okay. Shall I put it up on my screen?
That would probably be okay.
All right, yeah, I'm gonna get it open here. I've distributed this document as well as all the others to which we made reference today in an email to you all this morning. So if you care to open up your own copy, please go ahead and do so. I'm trying to get mine open here, and then I'll share my screen. Okay. Okay. I assume everyone can see this.
Yes.
Okay, so this is it's a draft proposal, again, addressing proposed small size, large size grants as distinguished from mega size grants. And we'll show you those features at this, as they've been discussed thus far here in the committee. At the last meeting, we did get to a point where we were talking about the sizing of small grants and the potential amount of money to be allocated from county ARPA funds for these types of grants. Small grants up to $2 million, for grants in the $100,000 to $250,000 range. And given those numbers, we would estimate between 20 and 30 grants being issued. And then the large grants, an additional $3 million allocated to that for grants sized $250,000 to $500,000. So possibly 6 to 12 grants in that range as well, for a total of $5 million to be put out there for these types of grant opportunities. And that is of the $30 million remaining following the allocation of $10 million of county funds to the 15 towns. So what we have here is just an outline form, some of the thinking around how we would go about this for the small and large size or medium size grants. We'd be thinking of a pre-application phase that's performed by the county, which would assist in informing and providing technical assistance to potential applicants. In other words, we would, this pre-application phase wouldn't be picking winners and losers at all. It would be providing information that would allow the applicant themselves to determine whether or not they have the capacity to perform under the requirements that put upon us by the ARPA reporting and so forth.
And if I may,
Yeah.
This would also allow who's ever collecting letters of intent to maybe look at proposals that are related and encourage larger ones. So one way to get the scope of some of these small proposals larger and more appropriate for the funds that we're getting.
Absolutely. That's equally important to try and find as many economies and opportunities for collaboration amongst interested organizations and towns as well. And as you'll see from the applicants'
eligible to apply. That will be coming up here. So there would be a letter, we would be asking potential applicants to submit a letter of intent that would demonstrate their capacity to comply with the ARPA related reporting requirements and expenditure categories. And of course, we would be, just scroll there, relative to the letter of intent, there would be, again, demonstrating capacity to comply, eligible use categories, and we would review those LOIs for their capacity, again, to avoid potential duplication of effort and so on. And importantly, and we have budgeted in our administrative budget, provision of technical assistance to assist potential applicants in pulling together their thinking, even in a pre-application phase. It's our intent to get as many people interested and activated to apply for these funds in the areas recommended. So again, pre-application phase, which would extend basically between the mid-August through the end of September. So a 6-week pre-application phase. And then we would, then there would be a grant application and review in nearly identical fashion to what the towns are doing now. Applicants that have a successful letter of intent submitted would be added to the portal. They would have their details regarding who their certifier would be and their reporter would be. But suffice it to say, the applicant's details will be added, uploaded to the portal, and the applicant would apply through the portal in the same fashion that the towns are doing now. There would be an item for discussion, and this application phase would theoretically, if the timeline holds, would be from October 1 to November 30th. So a good 2 months to apply. And then there's, I have I've identified some areas for discussion here by the group. Obviously, all of it's open for discussion, but if we don't have sufficient applications to absorb these smaller and larger grants, would we want to sort of open a second round and so on, potentially? After going into the portal, again, like the towns are experiencing now, the application enters the CLA level 1 and level 2 review, estimated to take about 2 months. Entirely dependent, the speed of which is almost entirely dependent on the applicant being able to supply additional information that might be required. So sometimes there's a slowdown when CLA is waiting for additional information to come in that they need to complete their review. The county then we have a sort of level 3 review, which would be at the county level. An ARPA review committee would be impaneled by the Board of Commissioners, potentially 7 to 9 members, to score projects based upon the evaluation criteria that we discussed previously, and that still remains open for discussion and is attached to this draft. Again, a further point of discussion would be, would the committee recommend that projects attain a minimum score to be recommended for funding, whether or not there's enough projects to absorb all the money? So that's an interesting question for us to discuss. And then as the grant application and review process concludes with the Board of Commissioners signing the contracts with successful applicants and the funds moving and the work beginning. Shall I keep going or shall I pause?
Are there any questions at this point?
All right, so who would be eligible?
Lisa has a
No,
question.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Real quickly, what is CLA? CLA review.
Clifton, Larson, and Allen is our, who's asking the question?
Lisa.
Wendy.
Lisa Dyer?
Yes.
Wendy. Oh,
Wendy.
Wendy. Those are the consultants accountants that the county has retained in order to set up our application portal and make.
Our ARPA experts.
There are experts on ARPA, and they are sort of evaluating the projects that come in against the requirements of the ARPA legislation and the guidance set forth by Treasury.
I would just spell out their name or refer to it in the document prior to that.
Right, thank you, good point.
Lisa?
Just for clarification, so we have an outline of small and large grants, but not mega before we get into the process. But then mega is included down below in eligible applicants. So the 5 million is just small and large and does not include mega grants.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, just because one wonders, well, what about mega? And the eligible applicants question is a very hot topic at this time. That I thought to, in the interest of providing full information here, as much as is known at this time, to put who mega eligible grant eligible applicants would be.
Yeah, I would just.
We can strike it as as a draft.
So I just point out, I think that the biggest challenge that this committee is going to have is this economy of scale in appropriating and making suggestions. The way that this is set up to get letters of intent and maybe be able to pool some of the applicants into a program that has a real regional impact is one advantage. What we witnessed earlier with some of the discussions around wastewater, for example, is that some of these projects are probably too big. So this is sort of a Goldilocks committee, right? So, but too small, too big. What fits? Which one is just right? And so I think the structure of the grant program and the potential recommendation initiation of the small grants program up front then allows this committee to spend a little bit more time on maybe some of the mega projects based on prioritization of regional challenges, because it's almost certain that we're not going to see a proposal for a mega project that's going to be consistent with the criteria that we've discussed today.
Yeah,
I think we're going to have to sort of figure some of that out.
I just had one other question. Which the small grants, wouldn't that be 8 to 20 grants, not 20 to 30, based on the grant sizes?
Your math is being questioned.
Yeah, did I divide it wrong?
I would rather like.
Well, no, I mean, $100,000 into 2 million is 20, right? So if we get, if potentially we get 100,000 grants, there's your $2 million.
Yeah.
Right, Lisa?
Yeah. So the grant sizes are 100,000 to 250,000. So you could get 8. And
that's true. Yes. Yeah.
I just don't want to set expectations appropriately. And the last thing I'll say, and
thank you.
Back to it, is if we're trying to encourage or vet or knit together potential collaborations, I think the timeline up front for even the LOI is incredibly tight for something like this, for people that don't know anything about it right now. I do think if we're trying to give people the opportunity to explore collaborations, trying to get, particularly nonprofits, to be able to do that before 9/1 in time for an LOI could be really, really tough. And I'll be quiet then.
No, that's a good point, and that's up for discussion and timeline. I think you see the whole timeline runs through, so the money wouldn't really be sort of out on the street until next May. Right, which if we look at, if the towns are going to have to couple their ARPA money and appropriate it through town meeting, it's the same time frame. But Lisa's point is well taken. This is a grant program that's not necessarily just a standard grant program. We do want to sort of look at what the proposals are and maybe have an opportunity to group some of them. So I think that remains, the timeline remains an open question. And maybe we can build some flexibility into the recommendation.
Thank you.
Sean.
I guess my question is, any consideration of grants smaller than the small grant, the minimum of the small grant of 100,000? And what I'm thinking about is, for example, in the broadband space, one thing that if we were to recommend, for example, to create grants funding for towns to do feasibility studies, which is an essential step for communities that are interested in municipal broadband. You know, Falmouth spent $50,000 to hire one of the top firms in the country. And by the way, I hate the term feasibility study because of course it's feasible, comprehensive community assessment, whatever you'd like. But so I guess what I'm saying is if a particular community was interested in, for example, getting grant money to pay for a feasibility study, and the minimum was 100,000, which is more than it would probably cost to do a feasibility study, that it might sort of unintentionally, you know, there wouldn't be an incentive there if we were going to recommend that. So just to throw that on the table in terms of smaller.
Good point, Sean. I think we had heard at one of the previous meetings that we wanted to set the minimum high enough that it would be worth people going through the process to sort of apply, but also so that the administration of the number of grants would be reduced. So
in the
once
instance,
again, Goldilocks, we're looking for the sweet spot.
in the instance that you described, Sean, that would be perhaps incentivize some sub-regional collaboration.
Yes,
Right.
multiple towns coming together for feasibility studies as under one grant would be one way.
Yeah.
One possible approach. But great point, Sean. Thank you. Dorothy.
This is related to Lisa's question, but the letter of intent timeframe. One of the things that I was thinking, as this is a proposal and the people to whom it will be presented are not necessarily here at the time, is that it be, in addition to it saying county staff will supply technical support to pre-applicants as needed, I think your intent relative to the encouragement of collaborations, it would be worthwhile to explain, because if somebody's looking at this on the outside, they may think, oh, you're putting your finger on the scale, whereas instead you actually want to articulate that it is an objective. And then I too had a teeny bit of concern just about the time slices from LOI to application that Lisa had, especially if on 9/15, for example, you brought people together, and so one of the questions is, do you actually have to have an LOI for the specific grant application that's subsequently submitted? So again, you may just want to add 15 days to each of those things to allow for some of that, but those were just my concerns.
Can I go back to what you first said? I just want to make sure I understand it. Well, are you suggesting that collaboration be removed, or it
No,
be
I was
discussed upfront?
enhancing it.
Enhancing
Yeah,
it,
so under Roman numeral 4, or Romanette 4, that technical support, but also that the county staff will, and then the good words that you used earlier, identify potential synergies and opportunities for collaboration and alignment between applications to encourage collaboration and, joining of applications. So saying that is an objective, so people understand that's an expectation.
Very good. Understood. Thank you.
Yeah, so collaborative grant applications might be ranked high. Especially if it's sort of like.
That's among the criteria. Yeah.
Right, so that's here, but what you're saying is just calling it out that county.
Oh, absolutely.
staff will- yeah,
We'll
I get
actually
it.
do that,
Yes,
exactly that,
understood.
thank you.
Yeah.
Karen.
Thanks. I'm not sure this is the time to talk about it, but I'm not sure about using funds to support feasibility studies in terms of the timeline and that, but I'd be interested in everyone's thoughts on that one. And it may not be the time to discuss that, but I think that opens up a whole Pandora's box in my own mind anyway.
I do think it calls out whatever sort of RFP we've sort of put out there probably has to have some glossary of terms associated with it, because I think there are studies like the broadband, the municipal studies on broadband, how they can come together and create their own utility is different than a standard kind of feasibility study.
Gotcha.
I don't know how we would define the difference, but I think to sort of Dorothy's point earlier, being explicit about how we sort of explain that will be helpful and useful in getting us the kind of applications, recommendations that we want to see.
Great, thank you.
Point. Okay, are there any additional questions on the draft
Well, I've still got.
No, yeah, to this point, because the next phase we're gonna get into is sort of the project evaluation scoring metrics, which I think is the part of this that might help us, might inform us as we go and begin ranking regional challenges. So Vera, back to you.
Okay, so just first of all, though, the eligible applicants, I think, is an issue of great interest to nearly everyone observing this process. And so the small, large grant eligible applicants would include nonprofit organizations, private for-profit, municipalities, and sort of subsections thereof, cities, towns, villages, other local units, local government units, such as fire and water districts and so on, as well as county government for the small and large, for these two smaller tranches. And then at the mega grant level, really the only entities that drop off are private for-profit organizations. And so the others remain eligible for applying in that regard as well.
Yeah, good point. And so I do think that for the committee's consideration, that having different eligible applicants for the small grant program might also be a useful tool in trying to promote applications that respond to the regional challenges.
Yeah, and collaborations. You have public-private sorts of work ongoing, and so I guess enough said. Yeah.
Okay, Lisa, I see this as a question.
I missed the last meeting, so I didn't, and I wasn't able to review the minutes. So if I'm asking something that was already discussed last time, I'm happy to just sort of table it. But for the eligible applicants, I don't know, there just feels to be an equity in the types of organizations that can apply for these funds. It's just not, I'm wondering if there had been any consideration prior to now to maybe allocate funding based off each of these kinds of entities versus putting them all in the same bucket for funding together.
So to sort of segment some of the proposed resources, so there'll be just nonprofit applications or just municipal applications?
Yeah, you have $5 million, like 1.25 for nonprofits, 1.25 for, I mean, this goes against the large versus small, but 1.25 for private for-profit, 1.25 for municipalities, 1.25 for county government. I just think it's just, there's just no, it's.
But if I could, I think where some of the equity comes in is really with the scoring that goes with the cross-cutting issues.
Well, it's a good point, Lisa. I certainly hadn't considered that. So I think the best thing to do would be to sort of step through the project evaluation scoring metrics and then come back to that point, because this is all a draft. So
Yeah,
it's really up
this is
to the
really
committee
to have something for you to
discussion.
kind of get your teeth into, and because this is how we're going to get some of the decisions made.
Okay. Karen, do you have a question?
Hearing none. So the time.
Kristen?
Yeah, I just want to add, I think I've said this at the last meeting, so apologies, but I also think some of the equity will hopefully come in with the intensity of the process and the reporting requirements. And I know that there's certain things that have to happen as part of this grant, but to the extent that we can create through the application process, the LOI process, whatever that looks like, the reporting process, something that's not overly burdensome to the subgrantees, I think will be greatly appreciated. I know, again, just from dealing with the funding that we've been doing and the restrictions, to the extent that we're able to create flexible processes for these and also still give the county the information that they need, will be really an essential part of the process.
Good point. Okay, Vera, let's step through the project evaluation score.
So just again, this item C here, section C summarizes the timeline of the subparts above and per the conversation here, subject to reconsideration. Importantly, though, the first line of item C here is the fact that the funding allocated in this fashion will have to go through an ordinance process, right? And so it's going to have to be recommended by county commissioners via ordinance, which will go to the Assembly of Delegates. And so the dates here are, you know, the 6/29 is the soonest date that the ordinance could go from the Board of Commissioners to the Assembly. And so the back end of that relates to the soonest point at which that entire process could be completed.
Great. Dorothy?
So assuming that in order to get that approved, you need this level of detail, I guess what I'm wondering in my head is why you wouldn't include the mega as an allocation in there. So that was my only question.
Yeah. And once again, it's up for the committee's consideration, but trying to read through some of the discussions we've had prior, there was a discussion about fencing off some money for certain priority areas. And so, I think the thought was a small and large grant program could be more detailed and clearly articulated at this point than maybe the mega projects. And
If I may, that was what my question is, do you actually have to provide the detail on the mega as opposed to the dollar allocation? So in other words, just carving out, is it possible to get approval to carve out the pool for the mega without the detail?
Yeah, I think that is one of the remaining open questions moving forward. And part of this plays into sort of the discussion between the commissioners and the Assembly so far around ARPA. And I don't think we want to assume, make any assumptions about allocating that. It's been a sensitive issue to date. So,
okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Rick.
Right, so that is why the timeline steps off at the particular point in time it does relative to the pre-application period, because there is this process, this financial and political process ahead of it. Madam.
Wait, I have to raise my hand.
No, I saw it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Recognize.
Please.
So I guess I'm going to go back to the question that somebody raised earlier, which is, why are we including the mega grant eligible application?
We should take
We should take it out.
I would recommend
Okay.
we take it out because,
Yeah.
All right.
I think
Sure.
it's,
it's muddies.
And it was not me that raised the question originally, but I think given what you just said.
Yeah,
Right.
that-
I agree.
I think for
Fine.
informational purposes for the committee, and
Yeah.
it's fine to include, but I do not think that probably not best to put that in the recommendation that we might vote on, send to the commissioners.
Thank you, Lisa and Dorothy.
Was Lisa nice?
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. All right. Given the above, and this is again, this should look familiar by this point. We've over the past couple of sessions have discussed this approach in concept, and now there's a bit more detail associated with it, subject to my math on the small project numbers, Lisa. We have, as a committee, discussed various selection criteria, and then scrolling down, Christie has presented to us the regional challenges. The committee has raised a number of cross-cutting issues that remain of importance. And then we've also begun discussing project outcomes and what we would like to see in a project. And so in an attempt to try and capture this mathematically and in a way that will allow for a scoring process if we decide that one is necessary, I've come up with the following. Out of 100 points, you'll notice that both the large and small projects, let me scroll down to here first. By virtue of articulating the points allocated for regional challenges addressed in an application, not not waiting or in any way making a determination about the more or less desirability of a project addressing a particular regional challenge. We're assigning equal points for any of the regional challenges applied for. For example, so a small and large grant or large grant applicant would get the same number of points if they were applying for a project that addressed water quality or childcare, and they would, and your points would go up the more regional challenges you address within your application. For the large and for the small and the large projects, mega projects we're holding aside for now. Cross-cutting issues are weighted slightly differently. Again, the more cross-cutting issues you address in your application, the more points you get. If your application happens to have a deleterious effect on a particular cross-cutting issue, you lose a point.
So just so I understand the math, so if it addresses a regional challenge, you get 60 points.
No.
I'm looking at the small projects.
If it addresses all 6 regional challenges, you get 60 points.
Okay, so is the, okay, so the summary is at the top.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the breakout is how it's, okay, got it. So
Nice.
you can
These are the
get up to 60 points if you address all of the regional challenges.
Yes.
Okay, so relative to the weighting of the, and this is where I was having trouble following it, meeting okay, so as a threshold, you have meeting this size. But in terms of meeting the criteria, the ARPA criteria, you're saying those two are just threshold that they're
Yeah.
either in or out, they're on or off. Okay, I got it.
Yes, thank
Sorry
you
to
for
be
the
slow.
question.
Go ahead.
Are there other questions right now? This is a
Sean,
Quick question. It just occurred to me, and I know that we've been doing this for some time now. Why is wastewater not in the infrastructure category? What's the,
Underwater quality.
These are the regional, here it's water quality, waste. These are the regional challenges as expressed by the Cape Cod Commission's work on the SEDS and the regional policy plan.
yeah, good point, Sean, but
I don't know.
You know, the regional challenges are grouped. They had to be grouped somewhere. I think some of these challenges could fall in one or more categories. I think we've decided to put wastewater in the water quality category. At least the commission has, because of the work that's been done at the county level and the problem identification that's already happened and a lot of the work that's underway.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
But
I think-
I guess what more to the point is, I guess is because water systems, wastewater systems being infrastructure, do they get automatic? Does that automatically get counted as both in the point system?
No.
Well, no, I mean, I think it would, right? Because wastewater is infrastructure, so, you know, in a sense, yeah, so broadband might only be infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's part of the work of this committee is to rank
Yeah.
and define the regional challenges in a way and make sure
Good
that the evaluation process is consistent with the regional challenges. So that's a great question, Sean. Thank you. Karen.
Go ahead.
I do think this is an excellent start. I'm finding it a little hard to get my head around the additive value of supporting all of the regional challenges and increase points there. And I just wonder if we shouldn't, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to suggest anything today. I just need to get my head around it a little bit more. But I'm
Yes.
not sure that's what we want to incentivize.
So, yeah, and so just for sort of point of information, we've tried to be as detailed, give you a framework of what a potential valuation scoring metric might look like. This is for you to sort of take for 2 weeks. So at the next meeting, we'll have an in-depth discussion about the specifics of the program. So we wouldn't be looking for a vote on this recommendation today. This is really a work in progress.
Excellent.
Wendy.
And I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to say goodbye real quick. I have to run to another meeting.
Bye, Karen.
Bye.
Hi, I think Sean brings up a good point that maybe infrastructure could just have parentheses next to it. This is excluding wastewater. I mean, but I look at housing as being infrastructure, so maybe a more discrete definition around infrastructure. And I too have a hard time thinking someone's going to like tick off all 6 boxes with a project. But I also believe in making it broad and letting the creative nature of the grant, requesters do their thing. So,
right. I mean, I think that was some of the thinking behind having a bit of a larger field of play for the small and large projects to, so that people, again, all of this is within what ARPA will allow, to allow people to come forward with their most creative thinking.
This is great feedback. It will allow for hopefully an efficient and enlightened conversation in 2 weeks. To the extent that we might be removing mega projects from the detail, we might be removing it from the star as well. So, yeah. Christy.
Thanks. I just wanted to clarify, and I just pulled up the presentation from the very beginning where we talked broadly about regional challenges, and it was globally water quality, but specific to fresh and coastal water quality. So that includes the 208 plan, all of the things in the RPP and the SEDS that point to the need for improved water quality, whether it's coastal or freshwater. So, it's totally up to you how you want to characterize it, but we do call it water quality as opposed to water quality wastewater.
Thank you for that clarification. Dorothy.
Just a couple of things. One is we have under regional challenges economic stability, and Christy gave a wonderful presentation on that. Then as a cross-cutting issue, we have economic development, and I didn't know if we wanted to have that as a duplication or not.
Good point.
Yeah, good point.
The second thing is to our conversation about infrastructure, and that was a great qualification on the water quality. Transportation is something we discussed. It really, that falls under infrastructure as well. So infrastructure is a fairly broad thing, and when we're discussing that with potential LOIs, I mean, we would want to make sure that it's clear. So should we give the, including but not limited to help people understand what we're talking about there?
I think they're good points, and I think this discussion points out the need to have some sort of definitional section and to provide some real guidance on a specific level.
Thank you.
Sean. Oh, good. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. This is really helpful. I mean, one can only go so far in a void here, so it's
absolutely. This is great. Really good work.
No, this is like an essential sort of part of this process to get the feedback of these highly engaged people. So we would also be scoring projects, potentially against the number of cross-cutting issues of concern that have come up here: barriers to accessing service, diversity, equity, inclusion, and vulnerable populations addressed, social determinants of health addressed. Mitigation of climate change effects to the extent that the projects in a small and large scale could do so. But here, sort of any sort of, you would also have in this situation and in the project outcomes situation, there would also be the potential for deleting points or having a negative point assigned if the particular project is deleterious to any of these particular priorities.
I think climate change is a good example of that cross-cutting issue where there could be deleterious impacts of the proposal.
Yeah, right. Let's say a project decides that they want to increase transportation, but they're going to use diesel engines and they're going to idle for 2 hours outside of the facility. And
yeah, we don't want any proposals where they are going to burn coal.
Yeah. Here in cross-cutting issues, we're incentivizing interagency, intertown collaboration. I'm looking at these. And as well, and it is duplicative. Economic development emerged as an important cross-cutting issue in our discussions here at the committee level. It is also prominently featured among the regional challenges, and so potentially not necessary to include it as a cross-cutting issue as well. And then we come to project outcomes, which need more definition. I think the group has been fairly clear on that. What do we want to see in terms of impact from these projects? And how do we wish to score that? Succeeding with it in falling in amongst the eligible use categories of ARPA and being able to report and addressing issues of concern and so on may or may not be enough to justify having a project funded, unless you know there are recommendations put forth on what outcomes empirically we're looking to see. We're looking for return on investment or other types of quantifiable impact. Do we want to assert some of those criteria as well?
Yes.
So that's these scorings flow upward, different weighted less so. Some of the more intense type of questions or criteria are weighted more lightly for the smaller sized projects and more heavily for the larger sized projects in how they flow upward.
So one of my questions is, will there be a range on some of the multi-point ones, or is it you just get the 10 points or the not 10 points?
Great question.
And this is me being icky picky. And you know, when Christy did the climate change piece, typically we talk about mitigation of climate change as that which stops climate change from happening. Adaptation, you know, in her presentation, as you saw, was adapting to climate change. So normally it would be climate change mitigation or adaptation.
Okay, thank you.
So
well said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, at this point, it is 12:45, and I want to be respectful of people's time. I think we put a lot of information out there for you to digest today. So I would suggest at our meeting in 2 weeks that we go through a ranking process of the regional challenges. We talk about prioritizing regional challenges. And part of that discussion, I think, will involve a discussion about the mega projects and about how many of the challenges we might want to put into that mega project category. So I think we should come with the information, the one pages that Christy has provided in 2 weeks to have ready to have that discussion. I think we do want to try to provide you with some visualization of where the ARPA funds have gone on federal, state, on a local level, and maybe where even some of the non-ARPA funds may come from that could be attached to some of the regional challenges. So we'll try to get that something together for you on that to provide some guidance. And then we'll come and review this proposal as a recommendation to the commissioners, which is potentially this committee's first vote, and I think an important one. I think we cover a lot of ground in 6 weeks. So we don't want to rush things, but we do want to be efficient moving forward. So those are my sort of proposals for the agenda in 2 weeks. You may have questions. I just want to remind the committee that we are subject to the open meeting laws. So I would encourage committee members not to discuss this with each other, but to instead come to the next meeting with the questions, and we'll hash it out at that point. Beth.
You can reach out to us in the interim.
Yes, you can reach out directly to county staff, to Beth or Vera, but that can only be one email to one email. Please don't include other members of the committee on any of those emails. So with that, I think it brings us to the end of our agenda today. Are there any questions or any input, suggestions from members of the committee before we move to adjourn? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Wendy?
So we, as Bert, we don't need a second for an
Bert
adjournment?
always says we
So-
don't need a second.
Okay. So we're adjourned. Thank you
No,
all.
you have to take the, oh, you don't have to do a roll?
Yeah, we do.
No, we do
We have to
a roll.
vote on it, though.
We do, okay.
Yeah.
You do have
This
to
is
vote
very
on it.
confusing. All right,
Sorry.
motion to adjourn on the table. We'll take a roll call vote. Dorothy Savarese.
Aye.
Sean Gonzalez. It's a guy on.
Aye.
Aye.
Wendy Northcross.
Aye.
Kristen O'Malley.
Aye.
Lisa Guyon.
Aye. Was that?
Did I double?
Yeah.
I called it twice. Well, you're that important, Lisa. Awesome. So we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, according, and I actually looked it up once, that Robert's rules said